The sound of bicycle tires humming against wet pavement was the last ordinary thing anyone ever heard from Emily Carter. It was just after dawn when the 14-year-old slipped quietly out of her family's house, careful not to wake her parents. The sky was pale gray, the air cool and still, the kind of early morning that felt safe and familiar. Emily balanced her backpack on her shoulders, her music case strapped securely to her back, and pedaled toward her rehearsal like she had done dozens of times before. She never made it. Emily was a gentle, focused girl, known for her discipline and her love of music. Rehearsals were important to her, she took them seriously, treating every session like a promise she intended to keep. That morning, she followed the same route she always did, a narrow bike path running alongside a canal, bordered by trees and low brush, eventually passing near a restricted military training area that locals barely noticed anymore. When Emily failed to arrive, concern set in quickly. At first, the instructor assumed she was running late. Then her phone rang unanswered. By mid-morning, the unease had turned into fear. Emily's parents retraced her route, calling her name as they walked the path she should have taken only hours earlier. They found her belongings first. A shoe near the gravel. A page of sheet music caught in weeds. Then, farther down the canal path, hidden behind dense vegetation, they found her. The discovery shattered the quiet morning. Authorities sealed off the area as investigators worked through the brush and mud. Emily had been attacked, her life taken where she had fallen. Her bicycle and music case were later pulled from the canal water nearby, weighed down and discarded as if someone had hoped they would never resurface. The crime scene sat in one of the most complicated locations imaginable, an area used daily by civilians but also bordering a military zone, with constant foot traffic, rotating personnel, and little surveillance. Investigators faced an overwhelming task almost immediately. They questioned soldiers, workers, joggers, fishermen, anyone who might have passed through that morning. Records were reviewed. Schedules examined. Alibis logged. Hundreds of names filled notebooks. Yet no clear suspect emerged. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Eventually, the evidence was catalogued, sealed, and stored away. Emily Carter's case went cold, not because it was forgotten, but because there was nowhere left to look. For her family, time stopped that morning by the canal. For the person responsible, time was quietly running out. In the days after Emily Carter was found, the canal path became a place of quiet dread. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, and patrol cars idled where joggers once passed without a second thought. The community gathered flowers along the fence line, candles burning long after sunset, as if light alone could undo what had happened there. Investigators worked relentlessly. The location complicated everything. The path was open to the public but threaded through land connected to a military training zone. On any given morning, dozens, sometimes hundreds, of men moved through the area, soldiers rotating in and out, civilian contractors, maintenance crews, cyclists, fishermen. Anyone could have been there. Anyone could have seen something. Or done something. Detectives conducted mass interviews, sometimes questioning men for hours only to uncover nothing concrete. Alibis were cross-checked against rosters and schedules. Logs were reviewed line by line. Every uniform, every vehicle, every face was examined. Nothing held. Emily's clothing was sent for forensic testing, but the technology of the time offered limited answers. Biological traces were detected, carefully preserved, and sealed with meticulous documentation. Investigators knew the evidence mattered, even if they didn't yet know how. As weeks passed, public pressure grew. Parents altered their children's routines. Cyclists avoided the canal path. Rumors spread, some pointing toward strangers, others toward insiders, but none supported by proof. Detectives revisited the timeline repeatedly. Emily had left home early. The window of time was small. The attack had been fast, deliberate, and brutal, suggesting someone confident, someone who knew the area well enough to act without being seen. But confidence alone was not evidence. After months of dead ends, leads thinned. Funding shifted. New cases demanded attention. Emily's file grew thicker, but answers remained absent. Eventually, the case was officially classified as unsolved. The evidence, her clothing, the recovered items, the preserved samples, was boxed, labeled, and placed into storage. Not forgotten. Just waiting. Years passed. Emily's parents marked birthdays without her. Her classmates grew into adults. The canal path reopened, and life, somehow, moved forward. Then, nearly 2 decades later, a quiet breakthrough arrived, not with sirens or headlines, but with a lab result. Advances in forensic science had transformed what once seemed impossible into routine procedure. Cold cases across the country were being reopened, one by one, using techniques unavailable at the time they were committed. Emily Carter's name surfaced again. Investigators retrieved the preserved evidence and carefully re-examined it. From fabric sealed away for years, analysts recovered genetic material, enough to generate a complete profile. For the first time since that morning by the canal, the person who took Emily's life had left behind a voice that could speak. The profile was uploaded to the national database. At first, there was silence. No match. No hit. Just another unanswered query. Then, as the reinvestigation neared its end, a notification appeared on a detective's screen. A match had been found. And it belonged to a man no one had ever connected to Emily Carter before. The match did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with disbelief. After nearly 20 years of silence, Emily Carter's case had produced a name, one that meant nothing to her family and had never appeared in the original investigation. The DNA profile pulled from her preserved clothing matched a man whose genetic information had been entered into the national database years earlier, following an arrest for a domestic assault. His name was Michael Harris. At the time of Emily's death, Harris had lived less than 10 miles from the canal path. He had been in his late 20s, worked irregular jobs, and had no connection, on paper, to Emily, her family, or her school. He had never been interviewed. Never questioned. Never even glanced at. Detectives reopened the old files and began again, this time with focus. Harris had a long, troubling history that had gone largely unnoticed outside his own home. Former partners described patterns of intimidation, sudden rage, and a need for control that often escalated behind closed doors. Police reports painted a picture of repeated domestic incidents, calls that ended in warnings, short arrests, and eventual releases. None of it had ever crossed paths with Emily's case. Investigators mapped Harris's movements from the time of the crime. Records showed he had access to the area near the canal through temporary labor work connected to facilities close to the military zone. He knew the paths. The routines. The blind spots. When police brought him in for questioning, Harris appeared calm, almost offended by the attention. He denied knowing Emily outright. Said he had never seen her, never been near the canal that morning. When confronted with the DNA match, his posture changed. He claimed contamination. Maybe his DNA had been transferred somehow, he suggested. A borrowed jacket. A planted sample. An accident. But each explanation shifted slightly, contradicting the last. Details blurred. Timelines didn't align. Investigators didn't rush him. They let the silence work. Over several days of interviews, Harris grew defensive. His tone hardened. He accused police of targeting him because of his past, insisting the science was flawed. Yet when asked to explain how his genetic material ended up on Emily's clothing, preserved, sealed, untouched for decades, he had no answer that held. Behind the scenes, detectives continued digging. They interviewed former partners who described behavior eerily consistent with the crime, fixation, sudden violence, an obsession with control. One woman recalled Harris returning home one morning years earlier with unexplained scratches and a bike helmet he couldn't explain. Piece by piece, the past began to line up with the evidence. Emily Carter's case was no longer cold. It was awake, and heading toward a courtroom. Once Michael Harris was formally charged, the investigation moved with a precision that had been impossible decades earlier. Detectives knew the defense would attack the science, the timing, and the long gap between the crime and the arrest. Everything had to be unbreakable. They started with the evidence. Each item from Emily Carter's case was brought out of storage and documented again, step by step. Labels from the original investigation were matched to logs. Seals were examined. Every hand that had ever touched the evidence was accounted for. Prosecutors knew that the chain of custody would be the backbone of the case. Forensic experts prepared reports explaining how biological material could survive on fabric for decades if properly stored, and how modern technology could now read what older methods could not. The DNA profile recovered from Emily's clothing was complete, clear, and statistically overwhelming. The probability that it belonged to someone other than Harris was effectively non-existent. As the case took shape, prosecutors built a detailed timeline of the morning Emily disappeared. They demonstrated how little time it would have taken for someone familiar with the area to intercept her, move her off the path, and dispose of her belongings in the canal. The location itself, busy but full of blind spots, was no longer a mystery. It was an opportunity. Harris's past came into focus next. While the court limited how much of his history could be introduced, investigators identified a consistent pattern: escalating aggression, denial, and blame shifting. Former partners testified about fear, control, and unexplained injuries. Their words painted a picture of someone capable of sudden, personal violence. During pre-trial hearings, Harris continued to deny everything. He claimed investigators were desperate to close a cold case. He accused laboratories of bias. At one point, he suggested that Emily's DNA evidence had been tampered with intentionally, an accusation that collapsed under expert scrutiny. The trial date was set. Emily's parents sat through every hearing, every motion, every delay. They listened to their daughter's name spoken in legal language, stripped of emotion, transformed into evidence. It was painful, but it was also progress. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was silent as prosecutors laid out the facts: a 14-year-old girl who never reached her rehearsal, a crime hidden in plain sight, and a man whose DNA had waited quietly for 20 years to speak. For Michael Harris, the waiting was over. For the jury, the story was just beginning. The courtroom felt heavy from the first day of testimony. Jurors listened as prosecutors walked them carefully through the timeline: Emily Carter leaving home before sunrise, the narrow window of time, the canal path, the hidden location where she was found. Each detail was delivered calmly, deliberately, as if speaking too loudly might break something fragile. Then came the science. Forensic experts explained how Emily's clothing had been preserved, how modern testing could recover genetic material decades later, and how the resulting profile matched Michael Harris with staggering certainty. Charts appeared on screens. Numbers were read aloud. The odds of the DNA belonging to anyone else were so remote they bordered on impossible. The defense pushed back hard. Harris's attorneys argued contamination, coincidence, and incompetence. They suggested the evidence had been mishandled, that memory had faded, that investigators were forcing a solution to an old tragedy. Harris himself took the stand briefly, repeating that he had never known Emily and insisting the DNA must have been transferred somehow. But under cross-examination, his story fractured. Prosecutors highlighted the shifting explanations, the inconsistencies, the lack of any credible alternative. They presented testimony from former partners who described Harris's violent behavior at home, careful not to overreach, but enough to show a pattern of denial and control. When the prosecution rested, the room was silent. Closing arguments were short and direct. This case, prosecutors said, was not about speculation or emotion. It was about evidence that had waited patiently for technology to catch up, and about a child whose voice could no longer speak for herself. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, no one moved. Michael Harris stood as the verdict was read, guilty of rape and murder. Emily's parents closed their eyes. Not in relief, but in release. Harris was sentenced to life imprisonment. He showed little reaction as the sentence was read, staring straight ahead, as if still searching for a way out through denial. Later, he appealed, claiming the DNA science was unreliable, that the conviction rested on flawed methods. The appellate court rejected the argument entirely, affirming the verdict and the sentence. The law had spoken. But the story was not yet over. Life moved forward again, but carefully, like a house rebuilt on cracked ground. Michael Harris disappeared into the prison system, his name replaced by an identification number, his days reduced to routine and restriction. From behind bars, he continued to insist on his innocence, filing motions and letters, repeating the same claims he had made since his arrest. None of them went anywhere. Years later, Harris applied for parole. By then, Emily Carter's case had become a reference point in law enforcement training, an example of patience, preservation, and the power of modern forensic science. Prosecutors prepared once more, this time not to prove guilt, but to ensure the sentence stood. At the parole hearing, Harris spoke calmly. He said he had changed. Said he had been misunderstood. Said the science had failed him. Emily's family spoke too. They described a 14-year-old girl who loved music, who kept her promises, who never came home. They spoke of birthdays missed, of a future erased, of a morning that never loosened its grip on their lives. The board denied parole without hesitation. Harris returned to his cell, where he remains today, his appeals exhausted, his story unchanged, his responsibility unaccepted. The canal path still exists. People walk it. Ride it. Pass through without knowing its history. The vegetation has grown back. The water moves on, carrying nothing of what it once hid. But for those who remember, that morning never truly ended. Emily Carter left home with her instrument and her plans, trusting the world to be what it had always been. The man who took that from her was not caught by luck or confession, but by time itself. And in the end, time spoke louder than denial ever could.